There comes a moment in the life of the seeker when the veil is torn away and the machinery of the self is laid bare. It is what many call an awakening, that sudden, often brutal confrontation with the unconscious and the realization that so much of what has been pursued was not of the soul, but of the persona. The ego, once sovereign, is dethroned. And in that moment, strangely, a great silence falls. Motivation, that driving force that once pushed you through the world, begins to dissolve. You wonder, where did the fire go? To understand this, one must not pathologize the loss of motivation, but rather read it symbolically. What dies is not energy itself, but the old orientation of energy. Prior to awakening, ambition may have stemmed from the shadow, a hidden desire to dominate, to be seen, to validate one's worth through external means. Awakening pulls back the curtain, and with that exposure, the drive that fed on illusion is starved. This is the death of the heroic ego, and like all deaths in the psyche, it is a necessary descent. One cannot skip the underworld. When the light first pierces the unconscious, it illuminates not only truth, but emptiness, a void where the false self once stood. The gods of identity, success, recognition, righteousness are sacrificed, and the soul grieves, but this grief is not a curse, it is an initiation. In losing motivation, you have not failed, you have outgrown your old fuel. You are no longer animated by the same myths. The danger, however, lies in interpreting this as laziness or apathy, when in fact it is a profound call to reorient one's life, to enter the wilderness and listen. What calls to you now may not shout. It may whisper in dreams, appear in symbols, or arise through deep longing that has no name. The task is not to rekindle the fire by force, but to wait with patience for a new center to emerge, one born not of persona, but of self. True motivation does not come from striving toward what society praises. It is born from alignment with the deep currents of the psyche. The process is cyclical: death, descent, reorientation, and renewal. To lose motivation after awakening is to be in the winter of the soul, a sacred pause before the seed of new life begins to stir. Do not rush it, do not panic, do not turn back toward distraction. Let the silence work on you. Let the old gods die, for when the self rises, it does not demand motivation. It becomes the source of it, and in that moment you no longer strive to live you are lived. The loss of motivation after awakening is not failure, but the death of ego-driven ambition. True motivation is reborn only when aligned with the deeper self, not the persona. True motivation is reborn only when aligned with the deeper self, not the persona. In the early stages of life, much of what we call motivation is in truth a complex arrangement of compensation. We strive for wealth, admiration, influence, or mastery, not necessarily because our soul demands it, but because our constructed identity, the persona, feeds on these achievements. The persona is that mask we wear to interface with the world, shaped by societal norms, expectations, family conditioning, and unconscious imitation. It is a necessary part of development, but it is not the self. The self lies beneath, older, deeper, a living center that speaks not in slogans or ambitions, but in archetypal language, dreams, images, longings that often defy logic. When one awakens, whether through inner crisis, trauma, spiritual insight, or the slow burn of existential dissatisfaction, the split between the persona and the self becomes intolerable. What once gave energy and direction suddenly feels hollow, artificial, or even repellent. This is not because the individual has become weak or lost, but because the motivating force that once animated them was not truly theirs. It was borrowed, inherited, or manufactured. Now, in the light of greater awareness, it cannot stand. And so the psyche withdraws, the well runs dry. In this phase, one might experience what is often mislabeled as depression or laziness, but psychologically, it is a recalibration. The libido, the psychological energy that fuels motivation, creativity, and movement, retreats inward. The outer projects that once seemed vital, lose their grip, and a kind of silence takes over. This is the withdrawal of energy from false gods. It is the beginning of individuation, the process by which the conscious personality becomes harmonized with the deeper self. The self is not interested in conventional success. It does not measure achievement by wealth, applause, or hierarchy. Instead, it seeks wholeness. And wholeness often demands a descent into the shadow, into the forgotten parts of the psyche, into the wounds and fears that the persona has carefully hidden. Motivation reborn from this depth is not manic or performative. It is not frantic with desire to be seen. Rather, it is grounded, steady, and inexhaustible because it emerges from an inexhaustible source, the inner totality of the psyche. To align with the self, one must relinquish the fantasy of immediate clarity. The self does not hand out 5-year plans. It reveals itself in fragments through synchronicities, recurring dreams, intuitive knowing, and the sudden, irrational pull towards something inexplicable. Motivation, when it returns, does so quietly. A forgotten interest resurfaces, a new question begins to haunt the soul. An act of service, once dismissed as unimportant, begins to feel like a calling. These are not mere whims, they are messages, and only by honoring them without trying to domesticate them through the persona's logic can one begin to live a truly motivated life. The motivation that comes from the self feels different. It does not drive you toward domination or control. It does not seek to prove your worth or secure your identity. It simply wants to manifest what already lives within you in potential. It wants to become conscious. This form of motivation is less like a sprint and more like a pilgrimage. It unfolds over time, shaped by symbols, setbacks, and revelations. It demands patience and humility, but it also brings a deep, almost wordless satisfaction, the sense that you are where you are meant to be, doing what only you can do. It is important to recognize that many people never reach this deeper alignment because the persona is seductive. It flatters, it promises praise, and so long as life remains comfortable or socially rewarding, the split between persona and self can remain hidden. But for those who have awakened, there is no return. The tension between who you pretend to be and who you truly are becomes unbearable. The only way forward is to listen and to act from a different place. This new place is unfamiliar, and it often contradicts the values of the external world. But this is precisely what makes it real. When motivation is reborn from the self, it is not a response to demand or expectation. It is an unfolding necessity. You do not act because you should. You act because to not act would be a betrayal of your very being. And in this way, motivation becomes not a tool of ambition, but an expression of inner truth. The loss of motivation after awakening is not failure, but the death of ego-driven ambition. When a person awakens spiritually, psychologically, or existentially, they often encounter an unexpected and confusing void. There is a tendency to believe that with greater awareness should come more drive, more clarity, more purpose. But what so often occurs is a profound disinterest in the things that once brought energy, focus, and excitement. Goals that once felt urgent become irrelevant. Paths that were once pursued with great effort suddenly appear meaningless. This shift is frequently misunderstood, even by the individual experiencing it, and interpreted as laziness, weakness, or depression. But to see it that way is to misread the signs of deep inner transformation. What has died is not the ability to act, but the false motivations that once animated the ego. The ego is a necessary structure. It gives shape and identity, allows for interaction with the world, helps form a sense of continuity and selfhood. But the ego does not operate independently. It is deeply conditioned by external expectations. From early childhood, individuals are rewarded not for who they truly are, but for who they are expected to be. Achievement, recognition, conformity, and approval are woven into the development of the ego's motivations. We are taught to want certain things: status, success, productivity, not because they are authentic to our inner nature, but because they serve the culture and the collective norm. As long as these values remain unchallenged, motivation flows, but it flows in service to an identity that may be fundamentally misaligned with the deeper self. One climbs the ladder, wins the praise, collects the symbols of success, and yet the soul remains untouched, unexpressed, sometimes entirely silenced. The individual is moving, perhaps even fast and efficiently, but not in their own direction. The energy that propels them is not rooted in essence, but in image. Then comes awakening. It may come through suffering, through spiritual practice, through the disintegration of external structures, or the weariness of a life that no longer makes sense. However it arrives, it brings with it a stripping away of illusion. The mechanisms of the ego are exposed. The individual sees clearly, often for the first time, that their motivation was never entirely theirs. It was a performance, a survival strategy, a story inherited rather than authored. In that moment, the engine stops, the fuel runs out. There is a stillness that can feel terrifying. Motivation vanishes not because something is broken, but because something false is no longer being fed. The death of ego-driven ambition is not a punishment, but a purification. The soul, sensing the collapse of false identity, withdraws its energy. It waits, not because it is passive, but because it will not invest in illusion. This death is essential. For real transformation to occur, the psyche must be emptied of what no longer serves it. Ambitions tied to external validation must be released. Dreams shaped by collective fantasy must dissolve. What remains is a kind of psychic nakedness, vulnerable, uncertain, and quiet. This phase is often marked by fatigue, apathy, or loss of direction, but beneath these symptoms is a deeper reconfiguration taking place. The psyche is reorienting. It is withdrawing its projections from the outer world and turning inward. The question is no longer, what should I do to be someone, but who am I beneath all the doing? In this space, conventional motivation cannot survive because its foundations have been dismantled. The ego can no longer seduce the individual with promises of identity through achievement. The soul is no longer willing to play along. This can be profoundly disorienting. The world continues to demand performance. Peers may not understand. Internalized voices of judgment may cry out. But in the language of depth psychology, this is not regression, it is descent. The individual is entering the underworld of the psyche, where false structures collapse so that something authentic can emerge. One is not falling apart, one is falling inward. The loss of motivation, then, is a necessary surrender. It is the relinquishment of striving that was never rooted in truth. This surrender cannot be rushed or bypassed. Attempts to reignite ego-driven ambition often fail because the soul resists re-entering the cage it has just broken free from. The emptiness must be endured. The silence must be listened to. Only then can something real begin to form. This realness does not emerge with the drama of ambition. It emerges in fragments, a renewed interest in something previously dismissed, a sense of peace in doing nothing, a quiet impulse toward an unfamiliar path. These are not driven by the ego's hunger, but by the soul's necessity. They do not seek applause or control. They simply wish to be lived. This stage of death, however painful, is sacred. The ego does not relinquish control easily. It clings, it tries to reassert itself, to find new goals, to rebrand the old patterns. But the awakened individual senses the hollowness of these efforts. The psychic energy refuses to cooperate. What is required is not another ambition, but trust in the deeper process of becoming, which cannot be commanded, only allowed. In many ancient traditions, this is recognized as an initiation. The initiate must be emptied before being filled. The old self must die before the new one can be born. In modern culture, this understanding is lost. We are taught to chase success endlessly, to never pause, to never stop producing, and so when motivation disappears we panic, but in the language of the soul this disappearance is a signal the old gods are dead. A new myth must be lived. The path forward cannot be chosen by the ego, it must be revealed by the self.